You're an embarrassment. Sign the papers and disappear." Julian Whitmore threw the divorce folder onto the hospital bed, his wife's hands still trembling, her body still broken from 19 hours of labor. 2 newborns, barely 4 hours old, pressed against her chest. He didn't touch them, didn't look at them. He just crossed his arms and waited. His mistress stood in the corner, watching. His mother smiled. And Amelia Hartwell, the woman they had spent years erasing, looked down at those papers without a single tear. Because 20 minutes before he walked through that door, she had just signed away $1.2 billion. To herself, "Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Hit the notification bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels." The morning Amelia Hartwell gave birth to her twins was the kind of February morning Seattle does without apology: cold, gray, the sky pressing down low like it had something to prove. The hospital corridor smelled the way all hospitals smell, that particular mix of antiseptic and recycled air and quiet dread. And Amelia had been in labor for 19 hours before the doctors finally placed one small, red, furious baby into each of her arms. She cried. Of course she cried. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. She had spent 19 months, 9 of them, carrying 2 human beings inside her body, holding herself together with nothing but willpower and private determination. And in that moment, with those 2 tiny faces pressed against her chest, she allowed herself to believe that everything she had sacrificed was worth it. That the cold silences at dinner and the absent look in Julian's eyes and the nights she had cried alone, while he was at events as he wanted invited to, she let herself believe all of it had led here, to this room, to this moment, to the beginning of something whole. She was 34 years old. She had given the last 8 years of her life to a man and a marriage and a vision of family that she had believed in with everything she had. She let herself believe for exactly 4 hours that she had not been wrong. Then Julian walked through the door. He was wearing the charcoal Brioni suit, the one she had picked out with him at Nordstrom 2 Christmases ago, when things were different, when he still asked her opinion. His hair was combed, his shoes were shined. He looked like a man walking into a board meeting, not a delivery room. And the moment Amelia saw his face, that particular set to his jaw, that careful blankness in his eyes, she felt something cold drop through her chest. Behind him came his mother, Margaret Whitmore, 63 years old and dressed like she was attending a funeral. And behind Margaret came Victoria Lane. Amelia had seen Victoria Lane at 6 of Julian's business events in the past year. Always near him, always laughing at something he said. Always dressed in the kind of effortless way that made Amelia acutely aware of every extra pound she was carrying, every inch of herself that she knew Julian had stopped seeing as beautiful a long time ago. Victoria Lane stepped into Amelia's hospital room, wearing a cashmere coat the color of cream. She stood near the window and said nothing. Julian walked directly to the table beside Amelia's bed. He set the folder down with a sound that was almost gentle, the way you might set down a glass of water, and he said, without looking at the babies, without looking at Amelia's face for more than 1 second, he said, "Sign them." Amelia looked down at the folder. She already knew what it was. Some part of her had known for months, and seeing it there, the legal weight of it, the finality felt like being struck. "Julian," she said quietly. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Her body was still shaking from delivery, but her voice was steady. "It's over, Amelia," he said. He put his hands in his pocket. "It's been over for a long time. I've been patient. I've waited. I'm not waiting anymore. You waited until today." She wasn't asking. She was naming it. He didn't flinch. "The timing isn't ideal." "I understand that. The timing isn't ideal." She repeated it back to him slowly. "I gave birth 4 hours ago, Julian. 4 hours ago. I know when you gave birth. Do you know their names?" She looked at him. "Have you decided you want to know their names?" Something crossed his face then. Something she couldn't fully read, and for one fraction of a second she thought she saw it, the man she had married. The man who used to reach for her hand across restaurant tables and call her the most interesting person he'd ever met. but it was gone before she could be certain it had ever been there. The lawyers have been copied on everything, he said. Evelyn Carver, whoever you've been talking to, she'll have the documents by end of day. Margaret stepped closer. Amelia had never loved her mother-in-law, and Margaret had never pretended to love her back, but there had always been a kind of strained civility between them, the kind that holds together for the sake of appearances. That civility was gone now. Margaret looked at Amelia the way you look at something you have been waiting a long time to discard. You always knew you didn't belong here, Margaret said. In this family, in this life, you came from nothing. Amelia, that's not a judgment, it's just a fact. And my son deserves someone who can stand beside him without embarrassing him. Amelia looked at the woman. She thought about the holiday dinners she had cooked in that Whitmore kitchen, the flowers she had arranged for Margaret's birthday parties, the way she had smiled and absorbed every subtle cruelty over 8 years without once raising her voice. I embarrassed him, Amelia said. People notice these things. Margaret gestured vaguely toward Amelia's body, and the gesture said everything the words didn't. Victoria shifted near the window, but still said nothing. She was smart enough to know her presence alone was the most devastating thing she could contribute to this moment. Amelia looked down at her babies. The boy had Julian's dark hair, already visible in small curls at his temples. The girl had Amelia's mouth, that slight fullness at the lower lip that Amelia had always been self-conscious about, and that now, looking at her daughter, she found she loved completely. She thought about what it would mean to sign those papers right now. Exhausted, bleeding, alone except for 2 people who despised her and one who had simply replaced her. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "No." Julian blinked. It was small, but she caught it. He hadn't expected that word. "Excuse me," he said. "No," Amelia repeated. She shifted the babies slightly, settled them against her. "I won't sign today. You can leave the folder. My attorney will review it." "Amelia, you're in my room," she said. Her voice was still quiet. She had always had a quiet voice. People had mistaken it for meekness her entire life. "I just gave birth to your children, and I'm asking you to leave." Julian looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Victoria. Then he straightened his jacket and said, "Have it your way, it changes nothing." He walked out. Margaret lingered for a moment, like she wanted the last word. But Amelia simply looked at her without speaking until she left too. Victoria paused in the doorway and finally spoke, just one sentence. "I hope you understand that fighting this will only hurt you more." Then she pulled the door closed behind her. And Amelia was alone with her children. She sat in that silence for a long time. The babies slept. The monitor beeped. Outside the window, the gray Seattle sky had darkened toward evening, and somewhere down the corridor a television was playing something that sounded like a game show. Amelia reached for her phone with the hand that wasn't holding her son. She didn't call a friend. She didn't call her sister. She opened her email and typed a 2-word message to Evelyn Carver. "It begins now." She pressed send, then she set the phone down, rested her cheek against her daughter's head, and closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise a long time ago that she would never let Julian Whitmore see her cry again. There was no one in the room to see her. She still kept the promise. She had met Julian Whitmore 10 years ago at a technology conference in San Francisco, back when he was still the hungry founder of a small startup, and she was a 24-year-old software engineer who had built her first AI prototype on a laptop she bought secondhand and kept running with duct tape and willpower. They were both presenting on the same day. His session was about building agile teams. Hers was about predictive logistics algorithms. His was better attended. He found her afterward at the coffee station and said, "Your work is remarkable. I've never seen anyone approach supply chain optimization quite that way." She had been so surprised by the directness of it that she laughed before she could stop herself. "Most people weren't paying attention," she said. "I was paying attention to every word," he said. His name was Julian Whitmore, and he was 30 years old, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from actually knowing what you're doing, which Amelia had as always found more attractive than looks or money. He was handsome too, but it was the intelligence she noticed first. They talked for 3 hours. He forgot to attend his own networking dinner. By the end of the night, she had shown him 3 of her algorithm sketches on cocktail napkins, and he had said, "With complete seriousness, you are going to change this industry." She married him 2 years later. She believed he meant it. The first years were good. Genuinely good. Julian built his company with the kind of relentless focus she recognized because she had the same quality herself, and she worked alongside him, not officially, not with her name on any documents, but substantially. She debugged his systems. She stress-tested his logistics infrastructure. She sat with him at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. and worked through problems that his engineers had given up on. He always thanked her privately. He rarely acknowledged her publicly. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was supporting a shared vision. She told herself the company was theirs even if the world only saw his name. She was wrong about all 3 things, but she didn't know that yet. What she did know was the precise date when things began to shift. She remembered it clearly because it was the anniversary of their 3rd year married. And instead of their usual dinner, Julian had a client and came home at midnight. And when she was awake waiting for him, he said, "You don't have to wait up," in a tone that made her feel small. Not angry, not cold exactly, just dismissive, like she was a responsibility he was reminding himself to manage. She started paying attention after that, the way he introduced her at events as my wife without her name. The way he stopped asking about her research, the way his eyes moved past her when Victoria Lane walked into a room. And she started working, not supporting his work, her own work. In the hours when Julian thought she was sleeping or managing the house or doing whatever it was, he had started to assume occupied her time. Amelia was building something. She was building the Hollow system. She had conceived of hollow heuristic adaptive statistic optimization 3 years into their marriage, when she identified a fundamental inefficiency in the way global supply chain AI processed disruption of events. Every existing system was reactive. It responded to problems after they occurred. What Amelia designed was a predictive system, a neural network architecture that could anticipate supply chain disruptions up to 18 months in advance, based on patterns invisible to traditional analysis. The implications were enormous. She ran the first prototype on encrypted servers registered under a shell company that Evelyn Carver helped her establish 2 years ago. When Amelia first understood that her marriage was becoming something she needed to protect herself from. She was not building Hollow as revenge. She was building it because it was extraordinary, and because it existed in her mind, and because she believed, at a cellular level, that the purpose of intelligence is to create. But she was also protecting it, every patent, every development log, every version record, every external validation, all of it filed, documented, verified independently, and registered in Amelia's name alone, under the terms of a clause in her marriage agreement, a clause Julian's had signed without reading it carefully because he had never imagined she was building anything worth reading a contract carefully about. The clause was simple. Any intellectual property developed independently by Amelia Hartwell, using resources not derived from the marital estate, remains solely her intellectual property. Evelyn had flagged it during the original contract review years ago and suggested Amelia include it. Amelia had included it. Julian had signed it. He had signed away his claim to a $1.2 billion deal on the day he married her, and he had never known it. The offer from Tech Forward Global had come in November, 3 months before Amelia gave birth. Tech Forward was a consortium of 6 multinational firms: logistics, retail, pharmaceutical, defense contracting, all of which had been watching Hollow's development through a licensed pilot program. The offer was $1.2 billion for exclusive licensing rights to the Hollow system. Amelia had negotiated alone with Evelyn's legal guidance. For 4 months, the final signature happened on her phone, in her hospital bed, 20 minutes before Julian walked in with the divorce papers. She had been looking at the confirmation email from Evelyn when she heard the door open. She had set her phone face down on the blanket and looked up at her husband in his Brioni suit. And she had known, in a way that was strangely calm, that whatever happened next, she was going to be all right. The deal was done. The patents were protected. Her children were alive and healthy and in her arms. And the man who had just handed her divorce papers had no idea that the woman he was leaving behind had just completed the largest single technology licensing deal in Pacific Northwest history. Evelyn Carver arrived at the hospital 2 hours after Julian left. She was 55, trim, gray hair, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular bearing of someone who had spent 3 decades in rooms where powerful men underestimated women and had learned to find it professionally advantageous. She sat in the chair beside Amelia's bed and looked at the divorce folder with the expression of someone who has just been handed exactly the hand she expected. "He served you in the hospital," she said. "It wasn't a question." 4 hours postpartum, Amelia said. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said finally. Amelia looked at her. "Good, every action he takes in this situation reveals his character. A judge will want to see who this man is. He's shown us very helpfully exactly who he is." She opened her briefcase and set a legal pad on her knee. "Walk me through the room. Who was present?" "His mother." "Victoria Lane." Evelyn wrote the names down without expression. "Victoria Lane was in the delivery room. She was near the window. She said one sentence to me that fighting this would only hurt me more." "She said this to you in the hospital room where you had just given birth?" "Yes." Evelyn looked up from her legal pad. "I'm going to need you to document everything you remember about today. The exact words, the sequence of events. We'll want your nursing staff as potential witnesses to the environment if the delivery of those papers is challenged." She paused. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Good. Did you say anything that could be construed as agreement or acknowledgement of their terms?" "I said no. I said my attorney would review it." Something that might have been a smile moved across Evelyn's face. That was the correct answer. Amelia shifted the sleeping boy in her arms. "He said the timing was, he said it wasn't ideal. Like he was apologizing for a scheduling conflict. Men like Julian Whitmore are accustomed to controlling the narrative," Evelyn said. "They confuse acknowledging a thing with managing a thing. He acknowledged it was wrong. He did it anyway. That distinction is going to matter. He doesn't know about the deal," Amelia said. "Not yet. When will he find out?" Evelyn considered this. "Tech Forward's announcement goes public in 72 hours. The press will connect the licensor to the company. The company is registered to you. By the end of the week, everyone will know." She looked at Amelia steadily. "How do you feel about that?" Amelia thought about it honestly. "I feel like I've been waiting for a long time," she said. "And I'm very tired of waiting. You won't have to wait much longer." Evelyn gathered her papers. "Rest, you have 2 newborns. The next 72 hours belong to them." She stood and put on her coat. "Let Julian have his celebration. Let him announce whatever he's planning to announce. Let him believe he has already won. And then, Evelyn said, buttoning her coat calmly, "we show him what he actually signed away." She left. The room was quiet again. The city outside was deep into its cold February dark, and Amelia's twins were both sleeping. The girl curled against her left side, and the boy in the bassinet, the nurse, had moved close to the bed. Amelia lay back against the pillows and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the 10-year-old version of herself, raised in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tacoma by a mother who worked 2 jobs and told her every single day that her mind was her most valuable possession, not her body, not her appearance, not what boys thought of her, but her mind. She thought about every professor who had doubted her, every colleague who had talked over her in meetings, every person at every one of Julian's events who had looked at her and seen only a large, quiet woman who didn't quite fit. She thought about Julian's mother saying she came from nothing. She thought about the number, 1.2 billion. She had built that from nothing, from a second-hand laptop and a mind nobody had credited and years of invisible work. She had come from nothing, and she had built something that would outlast every opinion anyone had ever had about her. She closed her eyes. Outside, Seattle went on about its February night. Indifferent and cold and vast, inside that hospital room, Amelia Hartwell held her children and slept. 2 days later, she received a text from a number she didn't recognize. It was a screenshot of an online business news article, freshly published. The headline read, "Tech Forward Global acquires exclusive license to revolutionary hollow logistics system for $1.2 billion. Below the headline, highlighted in yellow, was the name of the licensor: Amelia Rose Hartwell. Under the screenshot, the unknown number had typed 3 words. Did he know? Amelia stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "He's about to." She set the phone face down on the hospital bedside table. She reached for her daughter, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself a small, private, completely genuine smile. 3 days after Julian walked out of that hospital room, Amelia was discharged. She had spent those 3 days doing what nobody expected her to do. She did not cry at the nurse's station. She did not call Julian begging him to reconsider. She did not post anything on social media. She sat in that hospital bed, nursed her babies, slept when they slept, and answered every email from Evelyn with the focused precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for a very long time. The discharge nurse, a woman named Rosa who had been on shift the night the twins were born, stopped by the room one last time before Amelia left. She looked at the 2 babies bundled in their carriers, and then looked at Amelia and said quietly, "You're going to be okay, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. Amelia looked at her. "Yes," she said. Rosa nodded once, like she believed it, and walked out. Amelia lifted her son's carrier in one hand and her daughter's in the other, and she walked out of that hospital under her own power, without anyone holding the door for her, and she did not look back. She had arranged a car in advance, a driver she had used before, a quiet man named Gerald who had worked for the private transport company Evelyn's firm used. He loaded the carriers without being asked and drove without conversation, which was exactly what she needed. She did not go to the Whitmore house. She went to the apartment. 2 months before giving birth, Amelia had quietly leased a 2-bedroom apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, using funds from an account Julian had never had access to, under a name connected to her company's administrative address. Evelyn had helped her set it up. It was furnished simply and practically, and when Amelia walked through the door for the first time as a mother, she stood in the middle of the living room with a baby in each arm and breathed. It smelled like fresh paint and new carpet. It smelled like the beginning of something. She set the carriers down carefully, sat on the floor between them, and for approximately 45 seconds, she let herself feel the full weight of everything: the loneliness, the exhaustion, the sheer magnitude of what the next weeks and months were going to require of her. She let it wash over her completely. She did not push it away or manage it or reframe it. Then she stood up, went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea, and got to work. The first call she made was to Evelyn. "I'm at the apartment," Amelia said. "Good. Julian's attorney reached out this morning. They want to schedule the first mediation session within the week. Did they say anything about the Tech Forward announcement?" There was a brief pause on Evelyn's end that told Amelia everything. "They saw it," Evelyn said. "The announcement went public at 6 this morning. By 9, Julian's attorney had called me 3 times. What did they say?" "The first call was a request for documentation. The second call was a demand for documentation. The third call," Evelyn paused. "The third call was not particularly professional." "He's panicking," Amelia said. "He's panicking," Evelyn confirmed. "He had no idea. Whatever Victoria Lane and his advisors told him about your situation, about your financial position, about your activities during the marriage, none of it included this. He walked into that hospital room believing he was leaving a dependent housewife with no leverage and no resources." She paused. "He is discovering that he was mistaken." Wrapped both hands around her tea mug. What's our position? Strong, extremely strong. The patents are airtight. The development timeline is documented back 7 years. The marriage agreement clause is unambiguous. The only argument his team has at this point is to challenge the independence of the work, to claim that marital resources funded the development of Hollow and therefore the technology is a marital asset subject to division. Can they make that argument stick? Not with what I have, Evelyn said. But they're going to try, which means the next phase gets uncomfortable before it gets clean. They will go looking for anything they can use: financial records, communications. They'll try to depose people who knew you during the marriage and paint a picture of Alpha was secretly diverting shared resources. I wasn't. I know you weren't. We can prove you weren't, but Evelyn's voice shifted very slightly into something more direct. They're going to come after your credibility, your appearance, your background. They're going to try to make a jury or a judge see what Julian's mother saw when she looked at you in that hospital room. Amelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Let them. I want you to be prepared for it, Evelyn." Amelia set down her tea. "I have been preparing for this for 3 years. I know exactly who I am and exactly what I built." "Let them look." Another pause. "All right," Evelyn said. "Then here's what happens next." What happened next moved faster than Julian expected. Within 48 hours of the Tech Forward announcement, 3 things occurred simultaneously that would begin to reshape the entire landscape of what had seemed 4 days ago like a straightforward divorce proceeding. First, the technology press discovered the connection between the Hollow system and Amelia Hartwell. The initial articles were factual and brief. Startup founder licenses revolutionary logistics AI. Significant deal, Pacific Northwest company. But within hours, a reporter at a Seattle-based tech publication named Daniel Park made the connection that nobody else had yet made publicly. He posted a thread online that began, "Quick thread on the Hollow deal and why it's more interesting than it looks." The listener, Amelia Hartwell, is the wife of Julian Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Technologies. You may know Julian because his company announced last month that they were developing a next-generation logistics AI platform. You may not know that Julian's wife just licensed a logistics AI to a $40 billion consortium for $1.2 billion. I have some questions. The thread went viral by noon. Second, Julian's company Whitmore Technologies saw its stock drop 4% before the market closed. Not because of any legal action, simply because investors who read Daniel Park's thread started to ask he was asking was, and nobody at Whitmore Technologies had answers prepared because nobody at Whitmore Technologies had known there were questions coming. Third, Julian called Amelia directly. She was feeding her daughter when her phone lit up with his name. She looked at it for 2 full rings, then she answered. "Julian," she said, "what did you do?" It wasn't a question. It was barely even a sentence. His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, not anger exactly, but something underneath anger, something raw, disorientation. Maybe the particular vertigo of a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on was not where he thought it was. "I licensed my technology," Amelia said, "the technology I developed. The technology that belongs to me, that technologies," he stopped. Started again. "That technology was developed during our marriage. Using my resources," Amelia said calmly. "Documented. Evelyn has everything." Silent. "Julian," she said, "you should talk to your attorney. I am talking to you. Then I'll say this once." She shifted the baby to her other arm. "You came to my hospital room 4 days ago with papers and your girlfriend, your mother. You told me to sign and disappear. You told me I came from nothing. You didn't ask about our children." Her voice stayed even. "So I am asking you now to let the attorneys handle this. Because if you keep calling me directly, I'm going to stop answering." She ended the call. Her daughter made a small sound, a complaint about the interruption. And Amelia looked down at her and said softly, "Sorry. Baby, that's done now." She named them that evening. She had been carrying the names for months, having chosen them privately and not shared them with Julian, partly because he hadn't asked, and partly because they felt like something that belonged to her alone. Her son she named Thomas. Her daughter she named Clara. She introduced herself to them quietly that night, sitting on the apartment floor, a baby on each side, her back against the couch. "I'm your mother," she said. "And I need you to know a few things. You are going to have a complicated start to life. People are going to talk about your family, and they're going to have opinions. But I need you to hear this from me first." She looked from one to the other. "You come from strength. Whatever anyone tells you about where we come from, you come from strength." Thomas yawned. Clara blinked at her with enormous dark eyes. Amelia laughed, actually laughed. A real laugh, the first one in days, and the sound of it surprised her. How present and alive it felt in that quiet room. She hadn't lost her laugh. That felt important. The mediation session was scheduled for the following Thursday, 6 days after Amelia left the hospital. Evelyn had strongly recommended against attending in person. "Let me handle the first round. You're 8 days postpartum and I don't want them reading your face." But Amelia had been equally firm about being present. "They need to see me," Amelia said. "Amelia, they walked into my hospital room to humiliate me on the worst day of my life because they needed to see me weak. I want to be in that room, Evelyn. I want them to look at me and know that didn't work." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "Fine," she said, "but you say nothing unless I direct you to." "Not one word." "Not one word," Amelia agreed. She wore a navy blazer and her hair pulled back, and she arrived 5 minutes early, which meant she was already seated when Julian walked in with his team of 3 attorneys, all of them expensive, all of them looking at the table first and then at her. Julian looked different than he had at the hospital. The suit was equally good, but something in his bearing had shifted. He sat down across from her and his eyes met hers, and she watched him look for what he expected to find: uncertainty. Fear, the specific kind of social shrinking he had trained her into over years of small dismissals, and not find it. She looked back at him evenly. His lead attorney, a man named Bryce Calloway with a reputation for aggressive tactics in high-asset divorces, opened by establishing what he called the central question of asset origination. He spoke confidently about the shared nature of marital finances, about the impossibility of fully separating individual creative work from marital support, about the legal precedent for treating intellectual property developed during a marriage as joint property. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When Calloway finished, she opened her briefcase and began placing documents on the table. She did it methodically, without drama, stacking them in a precise order that she had clearly planned. 7 years of development records, patent filing dates, external server registration, financial statements from Amelia's independent accounts predating the relevant development period. The marriage agreement, open to the clause in question, with Julian's signature visible at the bottom. Then she placed one final document in front of Calloway. He looked at it. His expression did not change, but his hand went very still on the table. "What is this?" he said. "That," Evelyn said pleasantly, "is a letter from 3 independent technology experts who were engaged to review the Hollow Systems development timeline and verify that the work was conducted independently of any Whitmore Technologies resources. Their conclusion is on the 2nd page." She paused. "Unanimous." Calloway looked at Julian. Julian was looking at the document. "The clause in the marriage agreement," Evelyn continued, "is not ambiguous. It is not subject to interpretation. It says what it says. Julian Whitmore signed it with full opportunity for legal review at the time of signing." She folded her hands. "We are prepared to go to court. We are prepared to produce every document, every witness, and every record necessary to establish that the Hollow System belongs entirely to Amelia Hartwell. We are also prepared," and here her voice dropped slightly in temperature, just slightly, "to ensure that the circumstances of the divorce petition service become part of the public record." Calloway's eyes moved to her. "That's a threat. It's an observation," Evelyn said. "A man serving his postpartum wife with divorce papers in the presence of his companion while she held their newborns, that's a story. Mr. Calloway, judges are people, journalists are people. Shareholders are people." She paused. "Was her simply noting that we have the hospital visitor logs. the nursing staff's observations and a recording. The room went very quiet. Julian's head came up. A recording. Amelia said nothing. She had promised, but she held his gaze. My client documented the interaction, Evelyn said, as was her legal right. Calloway leaned over and said something quietly to Julian. Julian shook his head once sharply. Then he said, and this he directed at Amelia. Not at Evelyn, you planned this. Amelia said nothing. The timing. Coming to the hospital, you wanted me to. He stopped. Restarted. You set this up, Evelyn said. My client isn't going to respond to Amelia. Julian's voice cracked on her name. Just slightly, she looked at him. Did you know? He asked. When I came in, did you already know about the deal? Evelyn put her hand lightly on Amelia's arm. Amelia looked at her husband, her almost former husband, and she thought about every version of the answer to that question. The complete answer. The answer that included 20 minutes and a phone screen and a confirmation email from Tech Forward and a 2-word message to Evelyn. The answer that included everything she had built and everything he had dismissed and every night she had worked in silence while he slept certain. He understood exactly what their life was. She thought about all of it. Then she said, Evelyn, I think we're done for today, and she stood up. Calloway called after them that this wasn't over, that they'd be in touch, that there were significant questions remaining. Evelyn gathered her documents without hurrying. Amelia walked to the door, opened it, and held it for Evelyn, and they walked out together into the corridor. Neither of them spoke until they were in the elevator. Then Evelyn said, You weren't supposed to say anything. I said 4 words, Amelia said. You said 6. I think we're done for today is 6 words. Yes, Amelia looked at the elevator doors. I thought it was important to leave on my terms. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was. What Amelia did not know, could not have known, was what happened in that conference room after she left. She found out later from a source she didn't expect. Daniel Park, the reporter who had published the viral thread, reached out to her through Evelyn's office 2 days after the mediation session. He was polite, thorough, clearly well-researched. He wasn't chasing the divorce, he was chasing the technology story, the hollow story, and he wanted to understand who Amelia Hartwell was and how she had built something this significant without anyone in the industry knowing her name. Evelyn reviewed his request carefully. After speaking with Amelia, she approved a brief correspondence, not an interview. Not yet, just an exchange of written questions and answers that Amelia could review and control. One of his questions was, multiple sources have told me that following the initial mediation session, Julian Whitmore contacted Tech Forward Global directly to inquire whether the hollow licensing deal could be renegotiated or challenged. Tech Forward declined to comment. Are you able to speak to this? Amelia read that question 3 times. Then she wrote back, I'm not surprised, and no, it can't be. What she knew that Daniel Park didn't yet know was that Julian contacting Tech Forward directly had been a catastrophic strategic error, not legally damaging in itself, but revealing. It showed desperation. It showed he understood the deal was real and the patents were real, and that the woman he had dismissed as a housewife had built something he could not undo. She found out the details from Evelyn, who had heard from Tech Forward's legal team, who had documented the contact because they were required to. Julian had called Tech Forward's chief legal officer. He had claimed that the hollow system contained elements developed with Whitmore Technologies' resources, and that Tech Forward should pause the deal pending a full review. Tech Forward's CLO had asked him to provide documentation. Julian could not provide documentation because no such documentation existed. The call lasted 11 minutes. Tech Forward immediately notified Evelyn. Evelyn notified Amelia, and Amelia, sitting on her apartment floor with Thomas asleep on her chest and Clara in the bouncer beside her, listened to Evelyn describe the call and felt something complicated move through her. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than triumph. Something closer to the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath for a very long time, and you finally let it out. He went to them, Amelia said. He actually went directly to them. He did. He thought he could pressure them. He thought, Evelyn said. that his name still meant what it used to mean. He's realizing it doesn't. Not anymore, not after this week. A pause. The stock dropped another 2% today. Amelia closed her eyes. She was not glad about the stock drop. There were employees at Whitmore Technologies who had done nothing wrong and would feel that number. But she understood what it meant. He's losing control of his own narrative, she said. He never had control of it, Evelyn said. He only thought he did. The difference is becoming visible. The next week brought something Amelia hadn't anticipated. She received a call from a woman named Patricia Souza, the head of a nonprofit organization called Tech Women Forward, based in San Francisco. Patricia had seen the Daniel Park thread and done her own research, and she called Amelia directly on a number she had found through the company registration, which impressed Amelia because that number was not easy to find. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," Patricia said immediately, as though she'd anticipated the wariness. "I just wanted to say what you built, what you protected, how you did it. I've been working with women in technology for 20 years, and what you did is rare. The strategic patience of it. I wanted you to know someone saw that." Amelia didn't know what to say for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. It came out smaller than she intended. "How are the babies?" Patricia asked. Amelia blinked. "How do you know about?" The birth announcement was in the public hospital records. I looked. A pause. "Is that too much?" "It might be too much. I'm a mother. I kept thinking about you in that hospital, and I wanted to ask." Amelia looked across the room at Clara, who was awake and staring at the ceiling, with the concentrated expression of someone working through a difficult philosophical problem. "They're 2 weeks old," Amelia said. "They're extraordinary." "Of course they are," Patricia said. "Of course they are." That conversation lasted 40 minutes. Amelia had not meant to stay on the phone that long. But Patricia Souza had a way of asking questions that made it easy to answer them. And by the end, Amelia had said things she hadn't said out loud to anyone about what it had been like to work in invisibility, about the particular loneliness of being underestimated by someone who had once understood her value, about the years of building hollow in the margins of a life that seemed, from the outside, entirely domestic. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Patricia said near the end. "Yes. Do you regret staying as long as you did?" Amelia thought about it genuinely. She let the question sit. "Not exactly. I think I needed those years, not because of Julian. In spite of Julian, the invisibility, as painful as it was, it protected me. Nobody asked questions about what I was doing because nobody thought I was doing anything. I built Hallow in plain sight, and nobody looked." "That's extraordinary," Patricia said quietly. "That's survival," Amelia said. "Women have always known how to work inside the space that's left for them." There was a pause. "I'm going to ask you to speak at our annual conference," Patricia said. "Not now, when you're ready, whenever that is, months from now." "A year, whenever you're ready." Amelia said. "Ask me again in 6 months. I'll put it in my calendar right now." She did. Amelia heard the keyboard. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the quiet of the apartment. Thomas and Clara both asleep, the room gray and soft with afternoon light. And she thought about who she had been a year ago, silent and invisible, and slowly disappearing when they had stopped seeing her, and who she was right now, 2 weeks postpartum, sitting on the floor of an apartment she had chosen herself, with $1.2 billion in a deal that bore her name, and 2 children who would grow up knowing what their mother had built. The distance between those 2 versions of herself felt enormous. It also felt like something she had crossed entirely on her own, which meant no one could take it away. The 3rd week brought the deposition notice. Julian's team had regrouped after the disastrous mediation session and recalibrated their strategy. Callaway filed a formal motion challenging the validity of the marriage agreement clause on the grounds that Amelia had received inadequate independent legal counsel at the time of signing. It was a technical argument, creative in a way Amelia had to grudgingly respect, and it was designed to do one thing: invalidate the clause that protected Hollow as her separate property. Evelyn reviewed the motion and called Amelia that evening. "It's not a strong argument," Evelyn said, "but it's the best one they have." They need a judge to believe that you didn't understand what you were signing or that you were pressured into signing it. I had my own attorney review the agreement before I signed, Amelia said. I know, I was your attorney. Can they claim conflict of interest? They'll try. But I wasn't representing you in the divorce at that time. I was representing you in an entirely separate corporate matter. The distinction is clear and documented. A pause. Amelia, they're going to depose you, and they're going to be aggressive. I know. Calloway is very good at making people feel small in a deposition room. He uses silence. He repeats questions until the witness starts adding information they didn't intend to share. He'll bring up your weight, your background, your educational history, not directly. Never directly, but in ways that are designed to make you feel like you're defending your right to exist rather than your right to your own property. Evelyn, Amelia's voice was steady. I have spent 8 years married to a man who made me feel exactly that way every single day. Calloway doesn't have 8 years of practice on me. He gets one afternoon, a long silence. Okay, Evelyn said softly. Okay, the deposition was scheduled for the following month. But before that, 10 days before the deposition, on a Tuesday morning, while Amelia was on a call with Tech Forward's integration team about the Hollow implementation timeline, Evelyn sent her a text with no message. Just a screenshot. It was a photo from a gossip website. Julian and Victoria Lane photographed outside a restaurant in downtown Seattle. The caption identified them as a couple. It mentioned in the third paragraph that Julian Whitmore was reportedly involved in a contentious divorce proceeding involving a significant technology asset. Amelia looked at the photo for a moment. Julian looked tired. Victoria was smiling, but her eyes weren't in it. They were the eyes of someone who had expected something and was realizing the thing they'd gotten was more complicated than advertised. Amelia put her phone down and went back to her call. She did not feel the thing she'd expected to feel looking at that photo. She waited for the grief, the rage, the particular stabbing sensation of seeing the person who placed you stands next to the person who chose them. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to clarity. A sense of distance so complete it felt almost geographic, like looking at a map of a country she used to live in and feeling only the clean factual distance of having left. She had left, she just hadn't known it yet when he handed her the papers. She knew it now. That evening, after the babies were down and the apartment was quiet, she opened her laptop and started writing, not legal documents, not technical specifications. She opened a blank document and started writing the actual story of Hollow, the real story. The human story, the story of what it had taken and where the idea had come from, and what those years of invisible work had actually looked like from the inside. She didn't know yet what she would do with it. But she wrote for 3 hours, and when she finally stopped, her hands were shaking slightly, and she felt more like herself than she had felt in years. The truth was, she realized, that she hadn't lost herself in that marriage. She had just been waiting to be allowed to be herself in public. That wait was over. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late March, 6 weeks after Amelia had walked out of that mediation session on her own terms. 6 weeks of legal maneuvering, of Calloway's team filing motions and Evelyn's team answering them, of Julian's stock continuing its slow bleed downward, while the technology press kept asking questions nobody at Whitmore Technologies was prepared to answer. 6 weeks of Amelia waking up at 3 a.m, feed 2 babies, and then lying in the dark afterward, thinking through every possible version of what Thursday was going to look like. She was ready. She told herself that every morning while she made coffee. She told herself that while she walked Thomas and Clara in the double stroller around the Capitol Hill blocks in the early gray of Seattle mornings. She told Thomas and Clara directly, narrating it to them the way new mothers narrate everything to babies who cannot yet understand language but absorb tone like a second skin. We're ready, she told them on Wednesday night, Clara in her arms and Thomas kicking his legs on the playmat. Whatever they bring tomorrow, we're ready. Clara stared at her with the particular focused solemnity of a 6-week-old who has not yet learned that most human declarations are performative. Amelia found it steadying. She arrived at Calloway's firm at 9 on the dot. which meant she was 3 minutes early, which meant she was already seated and composed. When Bryce Calloway walked in at 9:03 with 2 associates and a legal assistant and the particular energy of a man who has spent 30 years winning rooms by entering them with maximum authority. He stopped when he saw her. It was small, a fraction of a second's hesitation, but Amelia had spent 8 years learning to read the micro-expressions of powerful men who underestimated her, and she caught it clearly. He had expected on some level a different version of her, a more diminished version. 6 weeks postpartum, facing the deposition that could determine the fate of a billion-dollar asset, having been publicly humiliated and legally attacked, he had expected someone who looked like what she had been through. She had worn the navy blazer again, her hair was clean and pinned. She had slept 4 hours the night before, which was actually a good night, and she had eaten breakfast, and she had kissed both babies before she left and told Evelyn's paralegal, who was babysitting for the morning, to call if anything was wrong. She looked completely, almost aggressively fine. Calloway sat down, arranged his documents, and said, without preamble, "Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for coming in, Miss Hartwell," she said pleasantly. "Or Amelia is fine." He looked at her, of course. He clicked his pen. "Let's begin." What followed was 4 hours that Amelia would later describe to Patricia Souza as the strangest experience of her adult life. Stranger even than signing a billion-dollar deal from a hospital bed. Because a deposition is a specific kind of psychological warfare, it is designed to look like information gathering, while actually being pressure application, and Calloway was masterful at it. He asked the same question in 7 different ways across an hour and a half. He used silence like a tool, letting it extend 10, 15, 20 seconds after her answers, waiting for her to fill it with something she hadn't intended to say. She didn't fill it. She had practiced this with Evelyn. "The silence is not yours to fill," Evelyn had told her. "You answer the question, you stop. Whatever comes after that is his problem," so she answered. She stopped, she waited. And around 11 in the morning, after 90 minutes of this, she watched Calloway recalibrate in real time. He had been methodical and confident in his opening, establishing the timeline of her marriage, her husband's company, the domestic structure of their life. Standard groundwork. Then he shifted. "Miss Hartwell, you've testified that you began developing the Hollow system approximately 7 years ago. Is that correct?" "That's correct. And at that time, you and Julian Whitmore were married." "Yes. You were living in the Whitmore family home in Medina. Your primary residence, expenses, mortgage, utilities, household maintenance were paid from joint marital accounts." "They were. And you yourself had no independent income during this period." Amelia looked at him. "That's not accurate." He paused very precisely. "Can you clarify?" "I had consulting income, but documented. I have the tax records." She looked at Evelyn, who was already sliding a document across the table toward Calloway's associate. Calloway picked it up. His expression didn't change, but his pen stopped clicking. "This income was disclosed on your joint tax returns?" he asked. "On my separate Schedule C filed jointly, yes," and he scanned the document. "In the first year, approximately $14,000. Approximately. That's not a substantial income." "Miss Hartwell, no," she agreed. "It's also not zero." "Which was the premise of your question." Evelyn's hand moved very slightly on the table. Amelia knew what that meant. Good, but careful. Calloway set the document down and shifted direction. "Let's talk about the development infrastructure for Hollow. The servers you used, the software licenses. Can you walk me through how those were funded?" "The initial development used open source software, which has no licensing cost. The server infrastructure was established through a hosting income paid my consulting savings and from personal savings held prior to the marriage in an account that remained in my name only." "You had premarital savings?" "Yes." "How much?" "Approximately $31,000 at the time of our marriage." "The account records are in the documentation Evelyn provided." He glanced at his associate, who nodded once. "And you're claiming that the entirety of Hollow's development was funded from this account and this consulting income?" "The development of the initial system. Yes, later stage development was funded through revenue from the licensed pilot programs, which is also documented. Pilot programs that operated during your marriage. Pilot programs that operated under a business entity registered in my name, using my intellectual property, generating revenue that was deposited into my business account. Not a joint account. Calloway put his pen down. That was when Amelia knew she was winning the day. He picked it up again immediately. Miss Hartwell, I want to ask you about your husband's company. Whitmore Technologies. You had access to that company's technology infrastructure during your marriage. Is that correct? I had social access to the company. I attended some events. I was occasionally present at the offices. But you had access. I had access to the lobby, she said. And the conference room where spouses were sometimes invited for company events. I did not have system access, server access, or any technical access to Whitmore Technologies' proprietary infrastructure. Can you prove that? Your client can prove it, she said. His IT department maintains access logs going back 9 years. Those logs will show my name appearing 0 times. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, let's take a short break. During the break, Amelia and Evelyn stepped into a side room. Evelyn closed the door and turned to face her. You're doing well, Evelyn said quietly. He's going to change tactics after the break, yes. He's going to get personal, Amelia already knew. The wait comments, not directly. He'll ask about your social activities during the marriage. About the events you attended or didn't attend. About what Julian described to others as your reluctance to participate in public life. Julian described me as someone who preferred staying home, Amelia said. He said it at every dinner. I heard him say it dozens of times. Calloway is going to try to use that to establish that you were socially withdrawn, isolated, possibly is experiencing psychological difficulties that affected your judgment at the time of signing the marriage agreement. Amelia looked at her. He's going to argue I was too depressed to understand a contract. Something adjacent to that. Yes, she thought about it for a moment, about what it meant that this was their best argument, not the facts. Not the law, not the documents. The best they had was trying to convince a court that Amelia had been too broken down to know what she was agreeing to. And if they can establish that, she said, they can argue the clause is voidable. It's a long shot legally. But it's designed to make you angry, to make you defensive. If you get emotional talking about those years, it gives him footage. Evelyn looked at her steadily. Don't get emotional. I'm not going to get emotional. Evelyn, I am 34 years old with 6-week-old twins and $1.2 billion in a deal that has my name on it, and I have been awake since 2:30 this morning, and I am sitting in a conference room owned by my husband's attorney, and I am completely fine. She paused. I'm not going to get emotional. Evelyn nodded once. Good. They went back in. Calloway had his second wind. He leaned forward slightly when they sat down, a physical signal of gear change. And he said, Miss Hartwell, I want to ask you about your well-being during the marriage. Specifically, whether there were periods of significant personal difficulty. Could you define personal difficulty? Amelia asked. Depression, anxiety, feelings of isolation, inadequacy. I experienced some difficulty. Yes. Can you describe that difficulty? I was in a marriage where my contributions were not acknowledged and my presence was treated as an inconvenience. That was difficult. Were you receiving any professional support? Therapy? Medication? I saw a therapist for approximately 8 months in the 4th year of our marriage. And what were you seeking support for during that period? Amelia looked at him directly. I was processing experience of being systematically diminished by someone who had once told me I was going to change the world. That's what I was seeking support for. Calloway paused. Were you ever diagnosed with? No, Amelia said. I haven't finished the question. I was never diagnosed with any condition that affected my cognitive function, my judgment, or my capacity to understand legal documents. If that's the direction of your question, the answer is no. He looked at her. She looked back. Miss Hartwell, he said, and his tone shifted into something softer, almost gentle, which was its own kind of danger signal. I want to ask you about the period when the marriage agreement was signed. You were 26 years old, 25, she said. I had turned 25 3 weeks earlier, 25. You had recently moved to Seattle. You didn't have family in the area, that's correct. You were building your life around Julian's career at that point. I was building my own career at that point. Julian and I were also building a relationship. But in terms of your social infrastructure, your support system, it was largely tied to Julian. I had colleagues. I had the therapist I mentioned. I had a friend in San Francisco I spoke with regularly. She paused. I also had at 25 a completed master's degree in computer science from Carnegie Mellon, 3 years of industry experience, and a first-generation draft of an algorithm that would eventually become Hollow. I was not adrift, Mr. Calloway. I was busy. Something moved in his face. She had landed something, and they both knew it. He glanced down at his notes. Back up at her, the marriage agreement, he said. Walk me through the signing. Who was present, Julian? Myself, his attorney at the time. I don't recall the name, but it's in the records. And Evelyn Carver, who was representing me. Evelyn Carver, he repeated. He looked at Evelyn, who sat still and composed at Amelia's left. Who is now representing you in this proceeding? Who represented me in a corporate matter at that time? Yes, some people might consider that a conflict of interest. Some people might, Amelia said. Courts have a defined standard for conflict of interest. I'm confident this doesn't meet it. How long did you spend reviewing the agreement before signing? Over the course of the preceding 2 weeks. I reviewed it in full 4 times. I asked Evelyn 12 specific questions about the intellectual property clause. I requested 1 amendment, which was granted. I then signed. Calloway stopped writing. He looked up. You requested an amendment, he said. Yes, to the intellectual property clause. Yes. The original language used the phrase primarily funded independently. I asked for that to be changed to funded independently in any part. The distinction matters when development costs are modest and spread across a long period. The room was very quiet. Evelyn had known this, Calloway's team had not. Because the amendment request and its resolution were in the version of the agreement on file, they were there to be found, but Calloway's team had been so focused on the clause itself that they had not traced the document's revision history. That revision history showed clearly and undeniably that Amelia Hartwell, at 25 years old, had read that contract with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was protecting and had negotiated to protect it more completely. She had not been a confused young wife who didn't understand what she was signing. She had been a 25-year-old engineer who saw the future clearly and protected it with the specificity of someone who intended to inhabit that future fully. Calloway set his pen down for the second time. He looked at his associate. The associate looked at the document. The associate said nothing. I think, Calloway said carefully, we'll take another break. This break was longer. 20 minutes, Amelia and Evelyn waited in the side room, and Evelyn did not say anything for several minutes, and then she said, The amendment. Yes, Amelia said. You never specifically mentioned the amendment to me. In our prep sessions, I assumed it was in the documents you had. It was. I had it. When you asked to make that change. At 25, you knew exactly what you were doing. I knew what I was going to build, Amelia said. I just didn't know yet how long it would take. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Amelia couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't professional admiration exactly. See, it was something more personal than that. All right, Evelyn said quietly, let's go close this out. Calloway spent the final 90 minutes of the deposition going through financial records, technical timelines, and pilot program agreements. His energy was different. He was still professional. Still thorough, but the sharp forward lean was gone. He was documenting, not attacking, building a record of what he had, not hunting for what he'd expected to find. At 2:17 in the afternoon, he said, I think that covers what we need for today. We may need to reconvene, but he looked at Evelyn. We'll be in touch, of course, Evelyn said. Amelia stood, put on her coat, picked up her bag. She nodded at Calloway, not warmly, but not coldly either, the nod of one professional to another. He nodded back. She walked out. In the elevator going down, She let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 6 weeks. "Well," she said, "we just won the deposition," Evelyn said. The amendment, the tax records, the consulting income, the access logs, the amendment." Evelyn shook her head slightly. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I have never seen a client sit in a deposition room and systematically dismantle every argument against them in sequence." In real time, without raising their voice once, Amelia looked at the elevator doors. "I've been practicing that deposition in my head for 3 years," she said. "Every time Julian said something at a dinner that made me feel invisible. Every time his mother made a comment about my background. Every time someone at an event looked through me. I was practicing." Evelyn said nothing, just nodded. The elevator opened and they walked out into the lobby, and Amelia pushed through the glass doors onto the street, into the cold March air, and she stopped for a second on the sidewalk and tilted her head back and just breathed. She had 2 hours before the babies would need her. She called Gerald, her driver. She called the paralegal to confirm the babies were fine. She called her mother, who lived in Tacoma and who had known something was wrong in Amelia's marriage for 4 years, but had waited to be asked before saying so. Her mother picked up on the first ring. "How did it go?" her mother asked. "I think we're going to be okay, Mom." A silence on the other end that held everything, all the years of watching her daughter disappear into someone else's shadow, all the worry that had lived in her chest since Amelia had called her 6 weeks ago from a hospital room. "I knew you would be," her mother said. Her voice was steady but rough at the edges. "I always knew. I know you did. Are the babies okay?" "The babies are perfect. And you?" Amelia stood on that sidewalk in the cold Seattle air, 34 years old and postpartum and exhausted and carrying a billion-dollar case, and 2 6-week-old humans and the full complex weight of a life she was rebuilding from the inside out. "I'm good, Mom," she said. "I'm actually really good." She meant it completely. The following Monday, something happened that Amelia had not anticipated and that changed the shape of everything. Julian gave an interview. Not a legal deposition, not a corporate earnings call, a sit-down interview with a business journalist named Harris Cole at a prominent national publication. The interview had been arranged weeks earlier, before the Tech Forward announcement, before the deposition, before everything. It was meant to be a profile piece on Julian's next-generation logistics platform, the one Whitmore Technologies had announced in January. Julian's PR team had apparently advised him to cancel. He hadn't canceled. The interview was published on a Monday morning, and Evelyn sent Amelia the link at 7:13 a.m. with a message that said simply, "Read this carefully." Amelia was feeding Clara when she read it. She had to put Clara down to use both hands to hold the phone because she needed to scroll carefully. Reading every word, Harris Cole was a good journalist. The piece was well written, structurally generous to Julian, and still somehow devastating. It described Julian's logistics platform in technical terms that were publicly available from Whitmore Technologies' own press releases. It quoted Julian on the vision behind the technology, on the problem it was designed to solve, on the market it was going to transform. And then in the 14th paragraph, Harris Cole wrote, "The platform Julian describes bears a structural resemblance to the Hollow system recently licensed to Tech Forward Global for $1.2 billion by his estranged wife, Amelia Hartwell." When asked about this similarity, Whitmore said, quote, "The concepts are adjacent, but the execution is entirely our own." End quote. He declined to provide technical documentation supporting this claim. He declined to provide technical documentation because he didn't have any. Because the technology Julian had been publicly describing as Whitmore Technologies' proprietary innovation, the platform he had announced to investors in January, the platform that had driven a temporary stock price increase that was now fully reversed, that platform did not exist in any documented, buildable form. What existed were concept documents that Julian's engineers had prepared based on Hollow's published pilot program data, which had been partially available in the logistics industry press. They had reverse-engineered the concept. They had not built anything. And Julian had announced it to investors as existing. Amelia read the article twice, then she called Evelyn. He told investors he had a working platform, Amelia said. Yes, he doesn't have a working platform. No, Evelyn, she stopped. Restarted, that's not a divorce issue anymore. No, Evelyn said. It is not. A pause. The SEC received 3 separate tips this morning from Whitmore Technologies shareholders. I heard about the first one an hour ago. The room felt very still. He's under investigation, Amelia said, not officially. Not yet, but the inquiry has been initiated. Evelyn's voice was careful in the way it gets when she is managing multiple very significant things simultaneously. Amelia, I need you to understand something. What is happening now is larger than your divorce proceeding. This is potentially a securities fraud matter. Julian's problems are no longer primarily about Hollow. They are about what he told his investors. Amelia sat down on the couch. Clara had fallen back asleep. Thomas was making small sounds from the other room. Did he steal my work? She asked, not angrily. She genuinely wanted to understand the mechanics of it. He used publicly available information about Hollow's pilot results to create a concept that he then presented to investors as a proprietary development. Whether that constitutes theft depends on specifics we don't yet have. But presenting it to investors as a working technology when it wasn't, Evelyn didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. What does this mean for the divorce proceeding? It means, Evelyn said slowly, that Julian Whitmore is about to have considerably larger legal problems than his custody and asset dispute with you. Which means his resources, his attention, and his attorney's attention are going to be divided. A pause. Which means our position gets stronger. I don't want to win because he collapsed, Amelia said. I know, I want to win because we're right. You are right, Evelyn said. And you're also going to win. Both things can be true. Amelia sat with that for a moment. What do I do today, she asked. Today, Evelyn said. Today you take care of your children. Let me handle this. She did. She took Thomas and Clara for a walk. She called her mother again. She ate lunch, a real lunch, sitting at the table instead of over the sink. She called Patricia Souza and left a message. She was ready to conference speaking date 6 months from felt suddenly very achievable. In the late afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she recognized as Julian's private cell. She hadn't heard from him directly since the call after the Tech Forward announcement. The message was 3 words, I'm sorry, Amelia. She stared at it for a long time. She thought about everything those 3 words did and did not contain. She thought about the hospital room and the charcoal suit and the folder hitting the table. She thought about Victoria near the window. She thought about his mother saying she came from nothing. She thought about 14 years of a relationship that had started with such genuine recognition and had ended with such deliberate erasure. She thought about Thomas and Clara and the life she was building for them, the one that had nothing to do with what Julian had tried to take. Then she set her phone face down on the table and went to pick up her son, who had started crying from his bassinet with the urgent conviction of someone who has waited long enough. I've got you, she told him, lifting him up, holding him close. I've got you, she did not write back. There are things that come too late to land, no matter how true they are. An apology delivered 6 weeks after a hospital table. 3 words in a text message from a man whose lawyers were still trying to argue she hadn't understood what she'd signed. Some things arrive after the door has already closed. And Amelia Hartwell, standing in her apartment with her son in her arms and her daughter asleep 3 feet away and $1.2 billion in a deal bearing her name, was not going to open that door. She was done waiting for Julian Whitmore to understand her value. She had always known it, and now the rest of the world was starting to catch up. The trial date was set for the 2nd week of May, 11 weeks after Amelia had left the hospital. 11 weeks that had moved with the particular compressed velocity of a life in crisis, each day containing more than a day should reasonably hold. Each week rewriting the landscape of what the next week would look like. By the time May arrived, the situation had expanded well beyond anything Julian's team had anticipated when they walked into that hospital room with a folder and a plan. The SEC inquiry had quietly formalized into a preliminary investigation. No charges had been filed, no public announcement had been made. But Evelyn's contacts in the financial legal community confirmed it was real and it was moving. 3 of Whitmore Technologies' 7 board members had retained independent counsel. The company's institutional investors had sent a joint letter to the board requesting an emergency governance review. And Julian's lead PR firm had quietly withdrawn from the account, citing a conflict of interest that nobody in the industry believed was actually the reason. Victoria Lane had not been photographed with Julian in 3 weeks. The gossip publications noticed, they always did. Amelia did not follow any of this closely. She had Evelyn for that. What she did follow, closely and daily, was Thomas and Clara Thomas, who had developed an opinion about the mobile above his bassinet and expressed it loudly. Clara, who had discovered her own hands and spent long minutes staring at them with scientific fascination. They were 10 weeks old and they were becoming people, distinct and specific and entirely themselves, and watching that happen was the realest thing in Amelia's life by a considerable distance. But the trial was coming, and the week before it, things accelerated. On a Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn called with a tone in her voice that Amelia had learned to identify as the tone she used when something significant had shifted. "Calloway called me this morning," Evelyn said, "and they want to settle." Amelia sat down slowly. Define settle. They're proposing to withdraw their challenge to the marriage agreement clause in exchange for agreeing not to pursue any claims related to the hollow technology being referenced in Julian's investor communications. Amelia was quiet for a moment. "They want me to let the investor fraud issue go, in exchange for full and uncontested recognition of your ownership of Hollow, which you already have, Evelyn confirmed. The offer is essentially we stop fighting what we've already lost, and you stop handing ammunition to the SEC. Do I have ammunition to hand the SEC, Amelia?" A pause. "The timeline of Julian's technology announcement and his knowledge of your Hollow development is. There are questions there that a federal investigator would find interesting. Questions like whether he knew about Hollow's pilot results and used them to generate investor enthusiasm for a platform that didn't exist. That's one way to phrase it. Did he know?" she asked. Not rhetorically, she genuinely didn't know the answer. Evelyn took a moment. "I think he knew more than he admitted to himself. Julian Whitmore is not stupid. He heard things over 8 years. Fragments, conversations you had with colleagues, the pilot program coverage in the industry press. I don't think he consciously sat down and said, 'I will steal my wife's work and lie to investors.' I think he saw something he wanted to be true, and he decided it was true. Because he had always decided things he wanted were real." She paused. "Men like him often don't know where their ideas end and other people's begin." Amelia thought about every dinner party conversation she had ever been edged out of. Every time she had started to describe her work and Julian had redirected the table to something else. Every time she had wondered whether he was embarrassed by her or afraid of what she might say. Maybe both, she thought now, maybe both. "What does Calloway actually want from this settlement?" she asked. "He wants the divorce finalized on the financial terms we've already established, your assets protected. Julian's business interests separated, child support and custody structured fairly. He wants it done before the trial and before the SEC inquiry becomes public. He's trying to contain the bleeding and custody, joint physical custody, primary residence with you, standard visitation for Julian with structured oversight during the first year, given the circumstances of the initial divorce filing." The circumstances, she let that sit. "You mean him serving papers in the delivery room? The judge assigned to this case is a woman who has been on the family patench for 19 years, Evelyn said. "I have been told informally that she found the hospital footage which was entered into the record during pre-trial motions profoundly instructive regarding Julian's character as a parent." Amelia breathed out slowly. "What do you recommend?" she asked. Evelyn was quiet for just a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is choosing their words with precision. "I recommend you think about what you want this to cost him," she said. "Not in dollars and exposure. The trial gives us a public forum. Every document, every timeline, every recorded moment from that hospital room, it all becomes public record. that has value in terms of the historical truth, but it also has costs. For Thomas and Clara, who will one day be able to read everything. For you, in terms of time and energy during what should be the first year of your children's lives. She paused. The settlement gives you everything you're legally entitled to. The trial gives you something closer to justice. Only you can decide which one you need. Amelia sat with that for a long time after they hung up. She called her mother that evening. Her mother listened to the whole thing without interrupting the settlement offer. The terms, Evelyn's analysis, and then she was quiet for a moment and she said, "What does your gut tell you?" "My gut tells me the truth should be on record," Amelia said. "Then it probably should be. Mom, the trial is going to be in the press. People are going to write about it. They're going to write about me. People have always had opinions about you," her mother said. "You built a billion-dollar company while they were having those opinions. I'm not sure their opinions have ever been the obstacle you thought they were." Amelia was quiet. "Your grandmother sold her jewelry," her mother said. "You know that story. I know that story. She sold it to pay for my first semester of college. She never told me until after she died. I found out from her sister. She never said a word. She just did what needed doing and let the results speak." Her mother's voice was steady and rough and entirely certain. "You know where you come from, baby. Let them find out too." Amelia called Evelyn back 20 minutes later. "We go to trial," she said. A pause. "All right, tell Calloway no." "With pleasure," Evelyn said. The trial began on a Wednesday morning in May, and the courtroom was more crowded than Amelia had anticipated. She had expected press. Evelyn had warned her there would be media interest, but the reality of walking into a room where reporters were already seated in the gallery, where her name had been on the legal tech blogs and business publications for 2 months, where people turned to look at her when she entered, that reality had a weight she had to absorb in real time. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything. She breathed through it and kept walking, and sat down next to Evelyn at the plaintiff's table, and placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, grounding herself in the physical fact of her own presence. She did not look at Julian. He was at the defense table with Calloway and 2 associates. She could feel his presence the way you feel weather, not looking at it directly, but aware of it pressing against you. The judge was the Honorable Sandra Reeves, 61 years old, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck that somehow reminded Amelia of Evelyn. She entered the courtroom with the unhurried precision of someone who has managed chaos professionally for 2 decades and no longer finds it particularly surprising. "We're here in the matter of Hartwell versus Whitmore," Judge Reeves said, opening her folder. "I've reviewed the pretrial submissions from both parties. I want to be clear about a few things before we begin." She looked at both tables. "This court is not a venue for personal grievance. I am here to determine facts and apply law. I am not interested in character assassination. I am not interested in extended emotional testimony that doesn't speak to the legal questions at hand. And I am not interested in what anyone in this room thinks the other party deserves." She paused. "I am interested in evidence. We'll proceed on that basis." Calloway opened for the defense with the technical argument, the marital asset claim, the challenge to the agreement clause, the assertion that Hollow's development had been materially supported by the infrastructure of the marital estate, even if not directly funded by joint accounts. He was polished. He was measured. He was making the best possible version of an argument that Amelia knew, and Evelyn knew, and from the slight tightening around Judge Reeves' eyes, Amelia suspected the judge knew, was not going to be enough. Evelyn opened for the plaintiff, and she started with the amendment. She put it on the projector, the revision history of the marriage agreement. The original language, Amelia's requested change, Julian's attorney's acceptance of that change, the final signed document, and she walked through it with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows that the document itself is doing the work. At 25 years old, Evelyn said, "My client read this contract with sufficient precision to identify a specific linguistic ambiguity, to understand its legal implications for intellectual property, developed over extended periods with modest resources, and to request a targeted amendment that resolved that ambiguity in her favor. She then signed the agreement she had negotiated. Evelyn looked at the judge. This is not the behavior of someone who did not understand what she was signing. This is the behavior of someone who understood it very well. The morning moved through testimony. Evelyn called the independent technology experts, first 3 of them, each with credentials that Calloway's team had tried and failed to challenge during pretrial motions. Each one testified to the hollow development timeline, to the independence of the work from Whitmore Technologies' resources, to the originality of the neural network architecture. The third expert, a woman named Dr. Vivian Marsh from MIT, said something that the courtroom responded to physically see: a slight collective shift, an intake of breath. Calloway had been cross-examining her on the question of whether any public information about Whitmore Technology systems could have influenced Hallow's development. Dr. Marsh looked at him with the patience of someone explaining color to someone who has claimed not to see it, and said, "The question you're actually asking is whether Amelia Hartwell could have gotten useful information from Whitmore Technologies. The more relevant question, based on what I've reviewed, is whether Whitmore Technologies could have gotten useful information from Hollow. And the answer to that question is yes. The pilot program data published in late 2023 would have given any competent engineering team a roadmap to Hollow's core architecture. Whether that data was used to generate investor enthusiasm for a platform that didn't yet exist, that's not a question for me. But it's a question someone should be asking," Calloway objected. Judge Reeves sustained it partially and instructed the jury to disregard the final sentence. But the final sentence had already been heard. In the gallery, 3 journalists were typing. The afternoon brought something Amelia had been prepared for and still found difficult. Calloway called Margaret Whitmore to testify. Julian's mother walked to the stand with the bearing of a woman who believes that bearing is itself a form of argument. She was 63 and elegant, and she sat with her hands folded and her back straight, and Calloway asked her gentle questions about the Whitmore family, about Julian's character, about what she had observed of Amelia during the marriage. Margaret described Amelia as someone who had struggled to adapt to Julian's social world, who had preferred isolation, who had seemed, in Margaret's assessment, unhappy and withdrawn in ways that had concerned the family. Calloway asked, "Did you ever observe Amelia Hartwell engage in any professional or technical activities during the marriage?" "She was on her computer frequently," Margaret said. "I assumed it was personal, social media perhaps. That sort of thing. You never observed her working. Not in any way that suggested professional work." No, it landed the way Calloway intended it to land: a witness painting a picture of a domestic, inactive woman who could not plausibly have built $1 billion technology in the margins of her marriage. Then Evelyn stood up. She walked to the podium, and she looked at Margaret Whitmore, and she said, "Mrs. Whitmore, you testified that you assumed my client was on social media when you saw her on her computer. How much time over the course of your son's marriage to my client would you estimate you spent in my client's presence?" Margaret considered this. "We saw each other at holidays, family events, perhaps us roughly," Evelyn said. "Hours per year, perhaps 40 to 60 hours per year. Over 8 years, that's roughly 350 hours, out of approximately 70,000 waking hours in 8 years. Evelyn paused. "You formed your opinion of what my client did with her time based on less than 1% of her waking hours. Is that accurate?" Margaret's composure held, but something beneath it shifted. "I can only speak to what I observed, and what you observed," Evelyn said, "was a woman on a computer which you interpreted as social media." Because she paused. Why social media rather than work? Margaret said nothing for a moment. "Because," Margaret finally said, "she never talked about working." "She never talked about it," Evelyn repeated. "To you, to anyone as far as I knew, Mrs. Whitmore. If someone showed you the patent registration for the Hollow system, filed 7 years ago, listing Amelia Rosa Hartwell as sole inventor, would that change your assessment of how she was spending her time on that computer? I can only speak to what I." "Would it surprise you?" Evelyn said. Directly, a long one, yes, Margaret said quietly. It would surprise me. Thank you, Evelyn said. No further questions. The next morning brought the moment that Amelia would later describe to her mother, to Patricia Souza, to her children years later, as the pivot point. The moment when the trial stopped being about a dispute and became about a truth. Evelyn had saved the hospital footage for the second day. She had not led with it. She had built the legal and technical case first, established the facts of Hollow's ownership cleanly and thoroughly, given the judge and the jury a solid factual foundation. And then, on the morning of the second day, she said, Your Honor, plaintiff would like to enter into evidence Exhibit 47, a video recording made by the plaintiff on February 14th of this year. Calloway stood. Objection, Your Honor. This footage is prejudicial and not relevant to the question of intellectual property ownership. Judge Reeves looked at him. Counsel, the defendant has raised the question of the plaintiff's state of mind and capacity at the time of signing the marriage agreement. Evidence bearing on the defendant's behavior toward the plaintiff is relevant to establishing the psychological context of the marriage. Objection overruled. The footage played. Amelia had not watched it since the night she recorded it. She had been aware of it, aware of its existence as a fact, as evidence, as something Evelyn had referenced in negotiations, but she had not sat with it, had not replayed it in her mind more than necessary. Watching it now in a courtroom, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Distance. She watched the woman in that hospital bed herself, 9 weeks ago, still trembling from labor, holding 2 newborns, and she felt for her the way you feel for someone you once were rather than someone you are. That woman was real, and she had been through something real, and the pain on her face in those moments, before she composed herself, was real. But she was not that woman anymore. She had crossed a distance in 9 weeks that some people don't cross in a decade. The courtroom was completely silent while the footage played. Julian sat at his table and did not move. On the recording, his voice was clear. Sign them. Our marriage has been over for a long time. And then Margaret's voice. You were never meant for this family. You came from nothing. And then Victoria's voice. Near the door. I hope you understand that fighting this will only hurt you more. And then Amelia's voice. Quiet and steady, even then no, and you're in my room. I just gave birth to your children, and I'm asking you to leave. The footage ended. Judge Reeves looked at her notes for a moment. Then she looked up. Mr. Calloway, she said, I'd like you to explain to this court how it is that your client's legal team determined that the appropriate moment to serve divorce papers was within hours of the plaintiff giving birth, in the presence of a third party who was not a family member, without any form of prior direct communication to the plaintiff. Calloway stood. Your Honor, the timing was carefully chosen, Judge Reeves said. Her voice had not risen, it was perfectly, precisely level. Because that's what it looks like. The gallery shifted. Calloway said the timing was determined by sit down. Mr. Calloway, she said it quietly. He sat. She looked at her notes again. We'll recess for lunch, she said, back at 1:30. During the recess, Evelyn found Amelia in the corridor and said very quietly, She's going to rule today. How do you know? Because I've watched Sandra Reeves for 20 years, and she just told Vas Calloway to sit down in the middle of his sentence. Evelyn looked at her steadily. She's not waiting. She has everything she needs. Is that good? When a judge who has seen everything stops waiting, Evelyn said, It means the answer is clear. The afternoon session was shorter than Amelia expected. Calloway attempted to reframe Julian's January investor announcement as speculative, forward-looking guidance protected under standard securities disclosure language. He put Julian's former CTO on the stand to testify that the platform had been in active development. The CTO testified for 22 minutes. Under Evelyn's cross-examination, he acknowledged that active development meant early-stage concept design, that no working prototype existed at the time of the announcement, that the announcement language had been prepared by Julian's communications team, not by the technical team. He acknowledged that Victoria Lane had been involved in preparing that communications language. The courtroom got very quiet again. Evelyn returned to her table and said, "Simply no further witnesses, Your Honor. Plaintiff rests." Judge Reeves looked at both tables. "I've heard enough," she said, "to rule on the primary questions before this court. I'll reserve detailed written findings for the formal order, but I want to address the parties directly." She looked at Julian. Julian looked back at her. He looked for the first time since any of this began, like a man who was genuinely uncertain of what came next. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "the evidence before this court establishes clearly and without reasonable doubt that the hollow system was developed independently by your wife, Amelia Hartwell, using her own resources over a period of years during which she was systematically excluded from the public and professional life of your marriage. The marriage agreement clause protecting her intellectual property is valid, enforceable, and was signed by you with full opportunity for legal counsel." She paused. "The $1.2 billion licensing agreement belongs entirely to Amelia Hartwell." She turned to Calloway. "The claim that your client has any ownership interest in the hollow system is dismissed." She turned back to Julian. "The custody arrangement proposed by plaintiff's counsel, joint legal, primary physical with Ms. Hartwell, structured visitation with review after 1 year, is adopted by this court. Your conduct in this matter, specifically the service of divorce papers in the circumstances documented in Exhibit 47, is a matter this court will consider in any future custody modification proceedings." She held his gaze. "I would advise you to reflect carefully on the kind of father you intend to be. Mr. Whitmore, your children will one day be old enough to read court records." The room was absolutely silent. Then Judge Reeves said, "We'll adjourn. Formal written order to follow within 5 business days." She stood. The bailiff called the room to order, and it was over. Not the way trials usually end, not with a bang or a dramatic outburst or the kind of catharsis that movies have trained people to expect. It ended quietly, procedurally, with the judge collecting her papers and walking out a side door, the way that real things end, with simple finality. Amelia sat still for a moment. Evelyn put her hand briefly on Amelia's arm, not a squeeze, not a celebration, just a touch of acknowledgement. "It's done," Evelyn said. Across the room, Julian was bent toward Calloway, speaking quietly. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't try. She reached into her bag and took out her phone and called the number for the paralegal who was watching the babies. "It went well," she said when the call connected. "I'm coming home." She stood up, gathered her things, and walked toward the doors of the courtroom. As she pushed through them into the corridor, a reporter she recognized from the Seattle Tech Press called her name. She stopped, turned. "Miss Hartwell, do you have any comment on the ruling?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about what she actually wanted to say. The real thing, not the official thing. "The truth," she said. "Takes as long as it takes. Today it was done by 4 o'clock. She paused. "I need to get home to my kids." She walked past the reporter, down the corridor, through the lobby, out the front doors. Gerald was waiting at the curb with the car. He opened the door without being asked. She got in. He pulled into traffic and she sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the May version of Seattle. The light finally returned after months of gray, the trees along the boulevard in full early leaf, and she felt the whole weight of the last 4 months move through her in one long wave. Everything at once, the grief and the fear and the exhaustion and the enormous complicated relief of it. And she let it come and she let it pass, and by the time Gerald pulled up in front of her building, she was composed and present and completely, entirely herself. She took the elevator up. She let herself in. Thomas was in the bouncer in the living room and Clara was in the paralegal's arms. And when Amelia walked through the door, both babies turned toward her voice before she even spoke, already knowing her, already oriented toward her the way living things orient toward what sustains them. She picked Thomas up and held him and stood in the middle of her apartment and said, quietly, to no one and to both of them and to the 9 weeks' worth of herself that had gotten them here, "We did it." Thomas made a small sound that she chose to interpret as his agreement. Clara kicked her feet. Amelia laughed. The truth had spoken. And it had been enough. The formal written order arrived on a Friday morning, 5 days after Judge Reeves walked out of that courtroom. Evelyn sent it by messenger, an actual physical copy. Not an email, which was Evelyn's way of saying that some things deserved to be held in your hands. Amelia was sitting on the apartment floor feeding Clara when the knock came. She signed for the envelope one-handed, Clara still in the crook of her other arm, and she set it on the coffee table and finished the feeding first. She burped Clara, settled her in the bouncer, checked on Thomas, who was asleep in the bassinet, and then she sat on the couch and opened the envelope. She read the entire order, every page, every paragraph. It took her 22 minutes. When she finished, she set it down carefully on the table, aligned it with the edge the way her mother had taught her to treat important documents, and she sat quietly for a moment with her hands in her lap. The hollow system, entirely hers, uncontested, permanent. Primary physical custody of Thomas and Clara. Structured visitation for Julian. Child support calculated on the full pre-separation income basis. The marriage dissolved on terms that protected everything she had built and everything she would build. She picked up her phone and called Evelyn. "I read it," she said when Evelyn answered. "And it's exactly what you said it would be, yes." "Thank you," Amelia said. She meant it in a way that the word barely contained, not just for the trial, not just for the past 4 months, but for the clause in the marriage agreement 8 years ago, for the encrypted servers and the patent filings and the shell company registration, for the 20 years of professional expertise Evelyn had put in service of a woman that the rest of the world had written off as someone who preferred staying home. "Thank you for all of it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You built it," Evelyn said. "I just made sure nobody could take it." After they hung up, Amelia called her mother. Her mother cried. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic woman, but Amelia heard it in her breathing. The particular catch that meant the relief was real and had been held a long time. "I need to see those babies," her mother said. "Come this weekend," Amelia said. "Come and stay. I'll drive up Saturday morning." "Drive carefully, Amelia." Her mother's voice steadied. "I'm always careful. It's you I was worried about. You don't have to worry anymore." Mom, a silence that held everything a mother carries when her child has been through something she couldn't protect her from. "I know," her mother said softly. "I know. The weeks after the order moved differently than the weeks before it. The compressed crisis velocity of the previous 4 months began to decompress, to breathe, to take on the slower rhythm of ordinary life, or what ordinary life looked like now, which was still extraordinary by most measures but felt, from the inside, like simply living. Her mother came Saturday and stayed for 10 days. She cooked things Amelia hadn't eaten since childhood: pot roast on Sunday, a specific bean soup that had been her grandmother's recipe and that smelled like every difficult winter of Amelia's childhood in the best possible way. She held Thomas and Clara for hours at a stretch and talked to them in a low, steady voice about things they couldn't understand yet and would understand completely someday. On the 4th evening, Amelia's mother looked at her across the kitchen table and said she would have loved them. Amelia didn't have to ask who she meant. "I know she would have, the jewelry." Her mother looked down at her coffee cup. "Your grandmother's jewelry. You sold it to keep his company alive." "Yes. Did he know that?" "No," Amelia said. "I never told him." Her mother nodded slowly. "Good. Some things you keep." Amelia thought about that for a long time after her mother went to bed. She sat in the quiet of the apartment with both babies asleep and the city doing its late-night business outside. And she thought about what she had kept and what she had given away and what the difference was between sacrifice and loss. Her grandmother's jewelry was gone. Those particular pieces of gold and stone were scattered into the world in exchange for cash that had kept Julian's company solvent through a crisis he had never known she resolve. She could not get them back, but she had not lost them. Exactly, she had traded them for something, not for Julian's gratitude, not for recognition, but for the knowledge, carried privately ever since, that she was the kind of person who could do that. Who could give the most personal thing she owned for a purpose she believed in? Who could act from love even when love was not being returned? That knowledge had been with her every single day since. It had been in the room when she negotiated the Hollow licensing deal. It had been in the deposition chair when Calloway tried to make her feel small. It had been in the courtroom when Judge Reeves spoke her name. You do not lose the person you proved you were capable of being. You carry them forward. 3 weeks after the order, Tech Forward Global's integration team began the full implementation of Hollow across their consortium's supply chain infrastructure. Amelia was not involved in the operational side. The licensing agreement covered that, but she received weekly progress reports, and reading them had a particular satisfaction that was hard to describe to anyone who hadn't spent 7 years building something in secret. The system worked perfectly, or as close to perfectly as a first full-scale deployment ever gets. The predictive accuracy of the disruption modeling exceeded the projections she had submitted in the original proposal by 11%. The Tech Forward CLO, a precise and undemonstrative man named Richard Huang, sent her a one-sentence email. Ms. Hartwell, the performance data on Hollow implementation through week 3 is remarkable. Well done. She printed that email and put it in the folder where she kept the original patent registration and the signed licensing agreement and the marriage agreement, with the amended clause and Judge Reeves' formal written order. The folder was getting thick. She liked in June. 6 weeks after the trial, Daniel Park published his full feature on Amelia in the Technology magazine. He had been patient. He had waited until the trial was over and the order was final, and Amelia had through Evelyn to a proper interview. They had met twice in the apartment with Thomas and Clara present, and therefore with natural interruptions that Park had navigated with good humor and Amelia had found unexpectedly humanizing. It is hard to maintain an artificial version of yourself when you are also trying to keep a 3-month-old from expressing himself loudly during a recorded interview. The article ran 12,000 words. It began with the hospital room and ended with the courtroom, and in between it told the story of Hollow, the real story, the technical story, the human story, with the kind of thoroughness that only happens when a reporter genuinely understands what they're writing about. Park had done the work. He had read the patents, consulted independent experts, traced the development timeline, interviewed Patricia Souza and 2 of the Tech Forward integration engineers, and, with Amelia's permission, Evelyn. Evelyn's quote was the one that traveled furthest. Park had asked her, "What do people misunderstand about Amelia Hartwell?" And Evelyn had said, "They think the remarkable thing is that she succeeded despite being underestimated. The remarkable thing is that she understood with perfect clarity that being underestimated was an advantage. She did not fight for visibility during the years she was building Hollow. She used the invisibility. That's not something they teach in business school. That's something you learn from a life." The article was shared hundreds of thousands of times in the first week. Amelia read it once, the morning it was published, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee that was actually hot for once, because both babies were still asleep, which was a minor miracle she intended to enjoy fully. She read it straight through without stopping. When she finished, she set her phone down and looked out the window at the June version of Seattle, the real one this time, the one with actual sun, the city finally making good on the promise it had been withholding all winter. She felt reading her own story told back to her accurately and completely for the first time, something she had not expected to feel. She felt recognized. Not famous, not vindicated, not triumphant. Seen by someone who had looked carefully and reported honestly, and given back to herself in a form that matched the internal experience. It was enough. It was more than enough. The interview requests came immediately after the article. Dozens of them television, podcast, business publications, a book proposal from a publisher in New York that arrived through Evelyn's office with a contract offer attached. Amelia read the interview requests, declined most of them, accepted 3 that Evelyn vetted carefully, and told the publisher she would think about the book. She was thinking about it. What stopped her from committing immediately was not modesty or hesitation. It was timing. She had started writing something herself. On those late nights after the babies were asleep, in the document she had opened the week after the trial. It had grown those pages in ways she hadn't planned. It was not a business book. It was not a self-help book. It was something harder to categorize, part technical history of Hollow, part account of the years inside the marriage, part something she didn't have a name for yet. She was not ready to show it to anyone, but she was also not ready to hand the story to someone else to write. She would figure it out. In July she moved. The Capitol Hill apartment had served its purpose. It had been the right place for the emergency of the first months, functional and private and hers. But Thomas and Clara were 4 months old, and she was ready for space, for a home rather than a temporary structure, for somewhere she chose fully rather than chose quickly. She found it through a real estate agent. Evelyn recommended a house on the eastern shore of Lake Washington, 12 miles from downtown Seattle, 4 bedrooms, a serious kitchen and a backyard that ran to the water's edge. It was more space than she and 2 infants strictly needed. She bought it anyway. The day she signed the purchase agreement, she called her mother. "I bought a house," she said. "On the lake?" "How did you know it was on a lake?" "Because your grandmother always said if you ever had money, buy water. Water is real." A pause. "Is it beautiful?" Amelia looked out through the windows of the empty house, at the lake visible through the back glass, the afternoon light doing something complicated with the surface. "Yes," she said, "it's really beautiful." "Good," her mother said. "Good." Moving day was a Saturday in mid-July, and her mother drove up to help, which meant her mother held babies while the movers did the actual work, and Amelia directed traffic with the particular focused energy of someone who has been planning the logistics of this specific transition for 4 months. By evening, the essential things were in place, cribs assembled, kitchen functional, the folder of important documents in the top drawer of her desk, in the study where she intended to do her best work. She stood in the backyard that first evening with a sleeping Thomas in the carrier on her chest, and Clara in her arms and her mother beside her, and the lake was doing the thing it does in the last hour of summer light, going gold, and then copper, and then something darker and more honest. And Amelia stood there and didn't say anything for a while. Her mother didn't say anything either. That was one of the things Amelia loved most about her mother. She knew when silence was the right language. After a while, Amelia said, "I keep thinking about what she said." His mother in the hospital room, her mother didn't ask which part. "She knew, you came from nothing," Amelia said. "That's what she said. Like it was a verdict, and I keep thinking she wasn't wrong about the facts. I did come from not much. 2-bedroom apartment, you working doubles? No family money, no connections, no safety net." She paused. But she was wrong about what it meant. She thought coming from nothing was a deficiency. She thought it was something I should be ashamed of. Amelia looked at the lake. It wasn't. It was my actual foundation. Everything I know about persistence and patience and building something with whatever you have. I learned that from our kitchen table in Tacoma, from watching you, from Grandma selling her jewelry without telling anyone. She stopped. Margaret Whitmore has never had to build anything from nothing. And she cannot imagine what that teaches you. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have said, the people who never had nothing are the ones who don't know what they have." Amelia nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. The first visitation happened in August. Julian came to collect Thomas and Clara for a Saturday 6 hours. Per the court orders, supervised by a mediator for the first 3 months. He arrived on time, which Amelia noted and credited. He was dressed simply, no briones, just jeans and a button-down. And he looked like a man who had lost 20 pounds and a great deal of certainty. Amelia met him at the door with both babies in the double carrier, which she transferred to him with practiced efficiency, demonstrating the latches, confirming he knew how both carriers worked, watching him settle Thomas and Clara against him with a care that she had not expected and that moved something in her she didn't want moved. He looked at them, really looked at them, maybe for the first time, and his face did something she had not seen his face do since the early years of their marriage. It opened, suddenly and completely, the way a face does when it encounters something it cannot maintain its defenses against. "They're so big," he said quietly. It was an obvious thing to say about a 6-month-old, and he seemed to know it. But he said it because it was what he was actually thinking. "They grow fast," Amelia said. Her voice was level. She was not going to make this warm, and she was not going to make it cold. She was going to make it functional, because functional was what Thomas and Clara needed from their parents. Julian looked at her. "Amelia, the mediator is waiting at the park," she said. "Her number is in the handoff folder. They both ate an hour ago. Thomas likes the blue elephant. Clara is going through a phase where she needs the pacifier to fall asleep, but don't offer it unless she's really upset." Julian looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said okay and nodded and walked to his car. She stood in the doorway until the car was out of sight. Then she went inside and stood in the quiet of a house with no babies in it for the first time in 6 months. She did not know what to do with herself. She called Patricia Souza. "The first visitation is today," she said when Patricia picked up. "How are you?" "I don't know. Weird. The house is very quiet. Do you want to talk or do you want distraction?" "Distraction," Amelia said immediately. "Perfect," Patricia said, "because I have been waiting 3 months to tell you about the keynote slot and I need an answer. The Tech Women Forward annual conference was in October. Patricia had secured a keynote slot and she wanted Amelia in it. 40 minutes, main 1,000 attendees, live streamed globally. Amelia had been deferring the answer for 3 months. "Yes," she said. Patricia made a sound that was not quite a shriek but was in that family. "Yes, that's a yes, that's a yes. Amelia, you just made my entire year. Don't make it a bigger thing than it is." "It is a big thing," Patricia said firmly. "It is a very big thing. You standing on that stage and telling that story, do you know what that means to every woman who has ever been told she's too quiet? Too big, too invisible, too whatever to matter? Do you know what it means to see someone who looked like they had nothing become someone who built everything?" Her voice caught slightly. "It matters, you matter." Amelia was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said finally. "That's why I said yes." She started writing the keynote the next day. It was different from what she had been writing privately, more structured. More intentional, shaped for a room rather than for herself alone. But the source material was the same, the real story. The actual story. She wrote the keynote in 4 days, which surprised her. Then she revised it for 2 weeks. Which did not. The first draft was too polished, too careful, too shaped toward the kind of narrative that audiences expect, and that doesn't quite land the way the rough truth does. She stripped it back. She took out the moments she had softened and put the actual moments back in. The hospital table, the silence she maintained in the deposition room, the amendment she requested at 25 because she could already see the future and she was not going to let it be taken. She sent the final draft to Evelyn, not for legal review, but because Evelyn was the person whose judgment she trusted most completely. Evelyn called her the same evening. "It's perfect," Evelyn said. "You're not just saying that. I have never in my professional life said something was perfect," that Evelyn said. "It's perfect. Give me the date and I'll clear my calendar." The SEC investigation became public in September. Amelia found out from a news alert on her phone while she was at the grocery store. Clara in the cart seat and Thomas in the carrier, which was how she did most things now in motion. With both babies, multitasking with the reliable efficiency of a woman who had learned to do important work in whatever space was available. The announcement was formal and brief. An SEC spokesperson confirmed a preliminary investigation into securities disclosure practices at Whitmore Technologies related to statements made in an investor presentation in January. No charges filed, investigation ongoing. Julian had not been charged. He might never be charged. The investigation might find insufficient evidence or be settled with fines and no admission of wrongdoing. Amelia didn't know how it would end, and she realized, genuinely stopped needing to know. She put her phone in her pocket. She turned back to the produce section. She said to Clara, who was examining a lemon with the focused interest of a researcher encountering a new specimen. "That's not for you." Clara looked at her with enormous reproachful eyes. "I know," Amelia said, "life is full of disappointments." "You'll learn." She put the lemon in the cart instead and moved on. The keynote was on the 14th of October, a Thursday afternoon. Amelia flew to San Francisco the morning before with both babies and her mother, who had agreed to handle the twins backstage so Amelia could actually speak without logistical emergency. She did not sleep much the night before, not from anxiety exactly. She had made peace with what she was going to say, and she trusted herself to say it. But there is a particular quality of alertness that comes before something significant. A heightened awareness of the present moment, and she lay awake with it and let it be what it was. At 5 a.m, she picked up Thomas, who was awake anyway, and sat with him in the hotel room dark and talked to him quietly the way she always had, narrating her thoughts to him because he was 6 months old, and the words didn't matter yet, but the tone did. And she had always believed that confidence is something you transmit through sound before you transmit it through language. "Today's a big day," she told him. "I'm going to go stand in front of a lot of people and tell them something true. I've been practicing telling the truth for a long time. I think I'm ready." She looked at him. "You've been practicing being alive for 6 months and you seem to be doing really well at it. So I think we're both going to be fine." Thomas put his hand on her chin. She took that as agreement. The conference center was loud with the particular energy of 1,000 people who are all there because they believe in something. Amelia stood backstage and listened to Patricia introduce her name. Hollow, the trial, the numbers, all the external facts that were true and accurate, and that somehow still felt like a description of someone else, and she breathed. Her mother appeared at her elbow. "Both babies are asleep," she said. "Of course they are," Amelia said. "They're finally cooperative when I least need it." Her mother laughed. Then she put her hand briefly on Amelia's face, just her palm, flat against her daughter's cheek, the way she had done since Amelia was a child when she wanted to say something that words weren't the right shape for. Amelia held still for it. Then Patricia said her name and she walked out into the light. The applause was immediate and substantial, and she stood at the podium and looked out at 1,000 faces looking back at her, and she thought, this is what visibility feels like. Not the kind that Julian had the visibility of being in every room, of having your name on the building, of having people recognize your face. This was different. This was the visibility of having been seen accurately, finally after a long time of not being seen at all. She waited for the applause to settle. Then she said, "When I was 25 years old, I asked a lawyer to change 4 words in my marriage agreement. The original language said primarily funded independently. I asked for it to say funded independently in any part. My fiancé signed the revised agreement without asking why I wanted the change." She paused. "I never explained it to him. I figured if he trusted me, he didn't need the explanation, and if he didn't trust me, no explanation would be enough." She looked out at the room. What I was protecting, with those 4 words, was something I hadn't built yet. A technology that existed then only as math on a laptop, and a certainty in my gut that I could not have defended to anyone at the time because I hadn't proven it yet. She stopped. I protected it before it existed because I knew it was going to exist. Because I knew what I was capable of even when no one else did. Especially when no one else did. The room was very quiet. 7 years later, that technology licensed for $1.2 billion. And the marriage agreement I had negotiated at 25, with those 4 words, meant that every dollar of it was mine. She paused. On the same day I signed that deal, my husband served me with divorce papers in the hospital room where I had given birth 4 hours earlier. He stood there in his best suit and told me to sign and disappear. He told me I came from nothing. She looked out. He was right that I came from nothing. He was wrong about what that meant. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about her grandmother's jewelry and her mother's double shifts and the second-hand laptop and the encrypted servers and the years of working in the space that other people's assumptions left open. She talked about what invisibility cost and what it gave. She talked about Evelyn, about Patricia, about Thomas and Clara, and the way watching two people become themselves from absolute zero had clarified something in her about the nature of building, that everything starts with nothing, that nothing is not absence but potential, that the people who understand that are the ones who build the things that last. She did not talk about Julian as a villain. She talked about him as someone who had never understood the woman he married, which was its own kind of tragedy and not the story she was interested in telling. The story she was interested in telling was about the amendment. About the 4 words, about what it means to protect the future before it exists. When she finished, the room stood. She stood at the podium and took it in, not with performed humility, not with deflection, but honestly, the way you accept something you have actually earned. She looked at 1,000 people on their feet, and she felt the full weight of the moment, and she let herself feel it completely. Then she walked off the stage. Her mother was waiting with Clara awake in her arms, and Thomas still asleep in his carrier on the floor beside the chair. Her mother's eyes were wet, and she made no effort to hide it. "Mom," Amelia said. "Don't," her mother said. "Just let me." Amelia let her. Then Clara made an impatient sound. She had spotted her mother and had opinions about the delay, and Amelia took her from her mother's arms and held her, and the moment shifted from something formal into something ordinary, which was better. That evening, after the babies were down in the hotel portable cribs and her mother was asleep in the second again, so the city outside was doing its indifferent San Francisco night, Amelia sat at the desk and opened her laptop. She opened the document. The one she had started the night after the trial. The one that had been growing for 5 months in the hours between feedings and legal calls and tech-forward integration reports, and the slow construction of a life that fit her. She read the last paragraph she had written. Then she wrote the next one. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote until the document felt complete in a way it hadn't before. Until the shape of what it was finally visible to her, not a business book, not a memoir, not a self-help guide, an account. The record of what it costs to build something real, and what it means to protect it, and what happens when the truth finally arrives. She titled it, that night, for the first time, 4 words. She saved it. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet hotel room and listened to her children breathe. 6 months ago, a man had walked into a hospital room and placed a folder on a table and told her to sign and disappear. He had brought his mother and his mistress and his certainty that Amelia Hartwell was finished, that she had nothing, that she had never been anything except a woman he was discarding. He had been wrong about all of it, not because luck had turned her way, not because fate had intervened or because the universe had corrected itself with any kind of dramatic justice, but because she had prepared, because she had protected the future before it existed. Because she had known at 25, sitting across from a marriage agreement and a man she loved who did not yet understand her, that the life she intended to build would require a foundation nobody could take. She had laid that foundation. She had built the life. And no one, not Julie, not Margaret, not Callie, not time, not the years of silence and invisibility and strategic patience, no one could reach it now. That was the whole of it. Amelia Hartwell had not survived her marriage. She had outlived it, and the difference between those two things was everything.